Star Wars shouldn't need any introduction. A global phenomenon in all of media, from movies to TV shows to video games. It's fair to say, Star Wars is everywhere. After the building blocks were put in place by the Star Wars Battlefront remake in 2015, and still running off the hype of the previous Star Wars Battlefront series, expectations were sky high for the sequel. DICE were heading into the project, coming off the success of Battlefield 1, so surely this would be just as good. What new characters will they bring into the game, and what iconic locations from the films will we see in the game? Everyone just couldn't wait to get their hands on the sequel, and it was set to make right on all the mistakes of the first game and introduce a fun campaign. And on November the 17th of 2017, we would find out. Iconic areas were present, and some fan favourite characters were in the game, but this was only a facade for the absolute mess that was hidden in plain sight. So prepare to spend 40 hours unlocking Darth Vader, whilst grabbing some popcorn, as I delve deep into the mess of Star Wars Battlefront II and its eventual redemption. In the introduction, I talked about the hype going into this game. Much like any piece of Star Wars media, fans of the movies and games alike were extremely intrigued to see the modern day interpretation of the Star Wars Battlefront series. So let's take a quick history lesson for a minute. In the 2000s, we saw the peak of Star Wars games. Games such as Knights of the Old Republic were covering the single player market, and covering the multiplayer market was the original Battlefront series. Whilst I haven't personally played any of the originals, their impact was undeniable, and reviews were solid from both reviewers and gamers. But for a while, there was a real lack of Star Wars games on the market. The cancellation of Star Wars 1313 left many disappointed. But in 2015, to go alongside the 7th episode of the films, there will be a rebooted Star Wars Battlefront game. Once people got their hands on it, however, it wasn't quite what we expected. The presentation and graphics were absolutely sublime, but a lack of characters and maps meant the game became stale very quickly, and it simply didn't have that fun factor that was provided by the originals. Now, where have I seen that before in Star Wars? Just a couple years later though, and a sequel was set to release. And after a strong DLC cycle, many were once again hyped for Battlefront 2. This game was set to coincide with the release of Star Wars Episode 8, so the Star Wars hype train was back at full speed. But as is the tale for many games, Star Wars Battlefront 2 fell flat. In fact, I'm lying. It didn't just fall flat, it hit the ground so damn hard that it sparked the decline of loot boxes and gaming as a whole. But I'm just getting ahead of myself. What actually happened? Where do I even begin? Let's start with the loot boxes. Introduced on day one as a core progression experience, they were used to unlock star cards that upgraded your characters that had a painstaking grind of their own. You want to play as Darth Vader, the most iconic villain in film history? Well, unfortunately, you better get grinding. You want to upgrade Darth Vader? Well, you better get grinding even more. In fact, it will take 40 hours on release to earn just one character. So as you can see, players were therefore encouraged to pay up, as who in their right mind wants to play Star Wars Battlefront 2 for hundreds of hours just to play as the iconic characters? This made loot boxes not only a core part of progression, but what felt like a mandatory purchase for some. The characters were obviously a huge selling point and part of the game, so of course people wanted to use them. And the star cards were so vital to ensure a level playing field. And if you didn't use them, you were at such a big disadvantage, and it would always come back to the same thing. You better spend money to actually enjoy the game. So what we're left with was a game that would cost you around £50 for a game that then forced you into spending further money just to be on an even playing field and to actually enjoy the multiplayer experience. Rightfully so, this caused absolute uproar and essentially ensured that this game was ridiculed even before its release, which caused EA to make changes on release and caused a scandal that left shockwaves throughout the entire gaming industry. This was the tipping point for many gamers. We were tired of loot boxes in every single damn game we played. FPS games, sports games, and now Star Wars games. It didn't matter the genre, and it ruined every single one of them in some way or another. This was the spark that led to loot boxes falling out of favour in games, and is why now we've seen the rise of the item shop and battle pass model, and why in some countries have even banned these glorified slot machines. The loot boxes in Star Wars Battlefront 2 was such a huge mess. So bad in fact, I haven't even talked about the game underneath. The game which so many didn't want to experience, and so many didn't experience after the scandal. But I think it's about time we talk about it. So already, you had Star Wars fans, including myself, who had refused to buy this game due to the pay-to-win elements in it. But unfortunately for some at the time, they still chose to purchase the game. What they were left with was the most bland, empty and soulless Star Wars multiplayer experience. But let's begin with the area of the game that hasn't changed, that being the campaign. The story of Iden Versio. This campaign, thankfully, is very short, as I'll just get straight to the point with you. It sucks. The mission design is painful. I mean, who remembers playing as Luke Skywalker just to kill bugs? Yep, I'm not joking. You may have forgot it, you may have played this campaign and forgot about it, but yep, there is a section in the game where you're playing as perhaps the most iconic Jedi in the entire series, and you don't do anything that interesting, you just spend 5 minutes defending an area and killing bugs. That is literally it. Yep. But I guess you could say at least you're using a lightsaber. But I'll stop you just there, because the lightsaber combat is awful. Janky. Not smooth whatsoever. You're not really in control of any attack. And this just makes the limited lightsaber missions that are in this game extremely forgettable. Look at the combat in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. There's seamless attacks that make you feel in control of every move. And whilst this game, yes, it's not the primary form of combat, it still feels really poor. And I'll use the word again. It just makes any lightsaber mission feel really bland. The missions with Iden, on the other hand, can be really immersive, as the gunplay and visuals are out of this world at times. It's just a shame then that the mission design is, and I'll use this word again, bland. Go to this area, defend your ally. Go to this area, secure it. Meaningless tasks in linear missions. The storyline itself is rushed through, and you'll never get a chance to feel engaged with what's going on, until it abruptly ends without anything really changing in the Star Wars universe. It doesn't give us any new perspectives, it doesn't give us any cool areas they could have used for the multiplayer, and most of the time, it just doesn't really feel like Star Wars. And that's the biggest critique I can give this game. It really is a bit of a waste of a campaign. They could have explored so many new areas. They could have given us iconic characters we'll remember. But instead, they give us a really boring plot, and they try to shoehorn in classic, iconic characters to try and make us care about it. But that's enough of the campaign. It's time we talk about the multiplayer. When I think of Star Wars, one of the first things that comes to my mind will be the iconic heroes and villains that we've seen over the years. Whether it's Count Dooku or Anakin from the prequels, Obi-Wan or Darth Vader from the originals, or well, it's actually hard to remember any sequel characters. But what about the TV show characters, Ahsoka, Savage Opress? Well, out of all of them characters I've just mentioned, guess how many were in the game on release? Give you a bit of time here. Maybe 3, 4? How about 1? Darth Vader was in the game at release, and that's it. The most obvious choice of the lot. How do you have a Star Wars game without Obi-Wan, without Anakin, without iconic Sith like Count Dooku, or other villains like General Grievous, and the list just goes on. Yes, some of these were added later, which we'll get onto, but these aren't side characters. These are key people in the Star Wars universe, all left out. This ultimately doomed creativity, as before any interesting characters could be thought of or brought in, we had to wait for ones that should have already been there to be added. And it wasn't just the characters that were left out, but also iconic locations and battles from the Star Wars universe. The game had the usual ones like Endor, Hoth, or even Starkiller Base, but the game lacked iconic areas such as Geonosis or Mustafar. It could have had areas from the many TV shows like Dathomir, or introduced new maps from the campaign, but it didn't. And despite having some cool maps that again looked visually stunning, to me it was much the same, with little inspiration from the vast amount of wider Star Wars media. Imagine a heroes versus villains battle on Mustafar, or a galactic assault battle on one of the newer planets introduced in the newer Star Wars films. Just something different is what I wanted from this game on release, but this game just simply could not provide that. The gameplay on release wasn't too dissimilar to how it is now. Yes, the game was very different in terms of its progression, and the sandbox was limited in terms of reinforcement and hero choices. But the gunplay and the core gameplay loop was much of the same. Galactic Assault was essentially operations from Battlefield. Capital Supremacy was much like Conquest, and then we had side modes like Starfighter Assault, which could be fun for a few matches too. But again, there was a real lack of variety here. The customization was pretty poor, and again was quite reliant on loot boxes and release. And the progression was an absolute mess until an update we'll look into in a bit. On release, Star Wars Battlefront 2 was a game that focused too much on being safe and making the game look incredible than it did on taking risks and making the game actually fun. Most of us had already experienced battling over Hoth with Vader and Luke in the first game, and whilst it was awesome to do it again, what about fighting over new areas with new characters from the vast Star Wars universe, which is constantly growing? And I think that brings us nicely into the DLC for Star Wars Battlefront 2, and thus began the redemption arc. DICE and EA knew something must be done to save this game and try and salvage its already ruined reputation. So work began on the DLC season for Star Wars Battlefront 2. We begin pretty soon after release, as to coincide with the release of Episode 8 The Last Jedi, we saw Finn and Captain Phasma added to the game. Out of the sequel characters they had to choose from, these are probably the two that made the most sense to add on either side. We would also see the planet Crate added to the game, which again, out of the forgettable sequel areas, Crate pretty made the most sense as it is probably the most memorable area from the film. Moving into 2018, and early on, we saw new fun game modes like Ewok Hunt or Jetpack Cargo to give this game a little more character, as well as new maps like Bespin or Jabba's Palace. Hero Showdown was also added to provide fun 2v2 battles on iconic battlefields, and despite being a bit rough around the edges, it's my personal favourite game mode in the game. 2018 was also hosted the progression update. Gone was the random and painfully slow progression of loot boxes, and instead introduced was a linear levelling system that allowed for everything to be unlocked by simply playing the game. A good change, but one that I'm sure you could agree should have been there since release. With the game in a much better state then, after the progression update, it was time for DICE to start having a bit more fun with their updates. And so began what I see as the golden era for Star Wars Battlefront 2. There would be some quality of life updates along the way, but at the end of 2018, we would finally see the iconic and long anticipated Obi-Wan Kenobi, General Grievous and Battle of Geonosis all added to the game. Two characters that everyone remembers alongside one of the most iconic prequel battlefields, and would end up being my favourite map. The game was truly on a roll as we entered 2019. January saw Count Dooku enter the game, and February's update would temporarily break the game as Anakin Skywalker truly felt like the chosen one, as no one else would choose anyone else until his overpowered abilities were eventually nerfed. Through the rest of 2019, new game modes, maps and features to polish the game were all added, until I finally caught notice. No matter how many times people told me this game had changed before, I simply could not ignore the release state, until I was finally caught up in the Star Wars hype train again. The end of 2019 was a pretty exciting time to be a Star Wars fan. The Mandalorian had been a huge success, the 9th film looked pretty awesome by the trailers, Jedi Fallen Order was incredible, and so I finally gave in and purchased Battlefront 2. To my surprise, it was incredibly fun, and as I looked into the future of the game, I wondered all the things that could be added, and the updates kept coming. Shortly after I started playing, we saw the introduction of BB-8 and BB-9E. Interesting heroes to say the least, but at least it kept the content moving. We saw new reinforcements shortly after, and it seemed 2020 was going to be a strong year for Battlefront 2. But then in May, we would receive a new map in Scarif. But to the surprise and disappointment of many, this would be the last of the updates that Star Wars Battlefront 2 would ever receive. It's been almost 4 years since DICE made a big change to Star Wars Battlefront 2. In that time, players have come and gone, and I've picked it up and put it back down a few times. So what state was the game left in after the tirade of updates between late 2018 and early 2020? Well, compared to the launch state, we now have a wider selection of maps and heroes, that contains most of the things we would want from the 9 films. Due to the sandbox being much improved, the gameplay has also benefited, and it's much more fun to hop into a game now, with all the different ways of playing the game. Saying that, however, some things are still lacking. A level cap of 50 means long-term progression is extremely limited, and the cosmetic items that you can now play for are not really that creative, and there isn't really that many of them in the game. Once you hit level 50, there really isn't much to do. There are some skins you can play for, but they take an absurd amount of time to get. And yes, you can obviously still play Galactic Assault and experience the core gameplay loop, but that does run old without anything to play for, or any new updates to look forward to. I did say though, we had a wider selection of maps and heroes, but to be honest, it is still pretty pitiful. No characters from Jedi Fallen Order or The Mandalorian were added in 2020, and since the game has stopped receiving updates, this game won't receive any new characters from the new games, TV shows, and eventually the new films. That means there will be no Cal Kestis, no Mandalorian, no Inquisitors, no Mace Windu, no Taron Malicos, no Qui-Gon, no Seer, no Dagon Gera, no Moff Gideon, and this game really never added Ahsoka. That also means there will be no Mandalore, there will be no Dathomir, no Kobo, no Coruscant, no Zepho, no Alderaan, and we won't be seeing Exegol anytime soon. By the end of this update cycle, this game had all the essentials, but none of the ones that would involve them taking a little bit of risk, where they would have to use a little bit of their own creative vices to come up with abilities or areas to fight over that weren't already in the films. Felicia is a good example where they did do this. A place shown in episode 3 for such a short time, yet they were able to make a really fun map out of it. They managed to give us BB-8 as a hero, so surely they could have found some abilities for Mace Windu. So much missed potential. They finally had the game in a good position. They finally had people on their side, or were getting people on their side, but then they stopped. They could have completed the 180 and turned this game around fully, but they didn't quite add that little bit of extra sauce that the game was lacking, and for that, it sat gathering dust. Many of us are holding out for a third game where all this stuff could be present, but that hope continues to fade. Star Wars Battlefront II has put its player base through a rollercoaster of emotions. From one of the worst game launches ever seen in 2017, to 2020, where talk about future updates had people incredibly hyped. I mentioned earlier a golden era for Star Wars Battlefront II that began in late 2018. That essentially lasted until the last update, as most of what DICE put out during that time would please fans. YouTube viewership was consistently good, and fans had finally started to turn their heads and look at this game as a good one. The hype for future updates was stronger than ever. People would theorise over potential characters that we could see and how they would impact the game. But our dreams were crushed before anything could materialise. What we are left with in 2024 is a complete product, but one that still shows a lack of ambition and one that still had so much potential to offer. The campaign still isn't great, but the multiplayer is currently the best we're going to get from a Star Wars game, and can provide a lot of fun and immersive battles in a franchise that so many of us know and love. It's for these reasons why I give Star Wars Battlefront 2 a 67 out of 100 score. When I first thought up of a score for this game, I was thinking much higher. But I think a lot of that comes down to my experience of the game being in that golden era. If we look at the early days, we simply cannot look past how rough they were. And even now, this game is nowhere near perfect. It lacks so many of the things that would have set it apart from the original Star Wars Battlefront series that were released a decade before, and instead is a better looking version, but one where a lot of the creativity, fun, and groundbreaking features are not present. The redemption of Star Wars Battlefront 2 has taken it from a game that was AAA trash to a decent and mostly fun Star Wars game, that everyone now looks back at as one with huge missed potential. I really hope we end up seeing a third game that takes on board community feedback and adds to the good base that this game ended up with. But I think many of us at this point have come to terms with the fact that that ship has probably sailed. But I've been Ranger, and this has been the redemption of Star Wars Battlefront.